This episode in Justice of Justice, 1 for 100 from the Machiavellian World Series, is brought to you by Viscard Studio.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. We take your sources, articles, research notes, and really pull out the key insights for you. Today we're digging into something pretty fundamental, something that challenges how we think about justice. You know that old saying, better 100 guilty persons escape than one innocent person suffer?
It's often quoted. Sounds noble.
Exactly. But what happens when you actually look at cases where innocent people do suffer? Even Benjamin Franklin, he struggled with this. He talked about this woman convicted, capitally convicted, for stealing gauze worth, 14 shillings?
A tiny amount, yeah.
And he asked, wasn't that punishment itself a punishment of innocence? It makes you think, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It forces us to confront that our justice systems, while they're fallible, human systems are.
Right. So that's our focus for this deep dive. The uncomfortable truths about wrongful convictions, the philosophy behind punishment, and also corruption, which turns out to be a massive human rights issue. We've got a great stack of sources here, legal journals, research reports, even some historical letters. Gives a really rounded view.
A lot to cover.
Yeah. And our mission today is basically to unpack all these complex layers for you. We want you to get not just what goes wrong, but why it matters and what's being done about it globally. Think of it as your shortcut to getting really informed on something central to how societies work.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's start with that core idea. The purpose of punishment itself. Our sources really get into the philosophical weeds here.
Yeah, and what's fascinating is this tension, really, between two main philosophical camps in the West. You've got Retributivism, often called just deserts. It's all about proportion, right? Punishment fits the crime, what's deserved.
Okay.
And then there's Utilitarianism. That one's about consequences, aiming for the greatest good for the greatest number. Judge the action by its outcome.
And this is where it gets complicated, right? Especially regarding innocent people.
Exactly. Because theoretically, a strict utilitarian view could justify punishing an innocent person if, say, it prevented mass riots or some huge societal harm.
Wow, that's a tough concept.
It is. It highlights the dilemma.
So how does this play out in, actual historical moments, big crises?
Well, we have some pretty stark examples. Think about Churchill, World War II, the Coventry bombing in 1940.
Right, the decision not to warn them.
Exactly. A brutal utilitarian choice, arguably, to protect the secret that they'd broken the German Enigma code, hoping to save more lives overall in the long run.
An unimaginable decision.
Or fast forward to 1991, the Rodney King case, the federal trial of the police officers after they'd been acquitted in state court. You can view that as a utilitarian choice, too, trying to quell the massive riots, prevent more death and destruction.
Okay, I see the connection. Minimizing overall harm, even in these extreme scenarios.
Yeah, in these huge crises, the alternatives are just so terrible that the utilitarian calculation, even involving the innocent, sort of loses its might, you could say. The choices are all bad.
But does that mean we should ever actually allow for punishing the innocent? It just feels fundamentally wrong.
No, not at all. And the sources are clear on this. The rule against punishing the innocent isn't just some isolated legal principle. It stems from a much deeper moral idea. You just shouldn't harm people who aren't blameworthy. Period.
Right.
Retributivists, for instance, they'd argue punishing the innocent is never intended in their system. It might be a foreseen, tragic side effect, but not the goal.
Intended versus foreseen.
Yeah, and that raises a really big question, doesn't it? Is that distinction truly persuasive when we're talking about something as serious as punishment and justice?
Definitely something to think about.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's shift from the philosophical side to the very real impact. Wrongful convictions. This seems to be getting more global attention now, framed as a human rights issue.
It really is. Around 2012, you saw a lot more international focus: Argentina, France, South Africa, China, many others. And the Innocence Network conference in 2013 had people from, I think, 20 different countries.
Wow.
And while individual efforts are vital, like the really intensive work in Australia that got people exonerated, the sources stress something important. The system shouldn't depend on these heroic, after-the-fact efforts to fix mistakes.
We need to prevent them in the first place.
Exactly. We need systemic reform.
So the big question then.
Yeah.
How do these systems, these well-meaning systems often, get it so wrong? What are the common threads?
Well, DNA exonerations, particularly in the U.S., have shed a harsh light on this. And studies, like one funded by NIJ back in 2012, confirm these factors. It's often a mix of things.
Like what?
Okay, first, a huge one: Incorrect eyewitness identification. It's a major contributor.
I've heard about that. Even how lineups are done can influence things.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Police procedures can unintentionally steer witnesses.
Yeah.
Then there's unreliable scientific evidence.
You mean forensic science?
Yeah, sometimes testimony is presented that just doesn't have a strong scientific backing. There's also this worry about adversarial bias. Evidence might get presented in a way that downplays weaknesses because it fits the prosecution's story.
Okay. What else?
False confessions. It's shocking, but people confess to crimes they didn't do. Psychological pressure, misunderstandings during interrogation.
That's hard to imagine.
It is. And finally, police and prosecutorial misconduct. Things like hiding evidence that could help the defendant or using improper investigation methods.
So it's not always just one thing, like a single piece of bad evidence.
Rarely.
Yeah.
And that American University study you mentioned, it also pointed to broader issues causing tunnel vision.
Tunnel vision.
Yeah, locking on to a suspect or theory early on and then unconsciously filtering out information that contradicts it, like looking through a keyhole.
Right. Confirmation bias.
Exactly. And factors like how strong the initial evidence seemed, how good the defense lawyer was, even how punitive the state's culture was, like how many executions they carried out.
So weaker cases, ineffective defense, harsher environments.
They tended to correlate with more wrongful convictions. It's systemic.
Okay, here's something that really blows my mind. Plea bargains. Most cases don't even go to trial. How does that fit in?
That's a huge piece of the puzzle. The standard model assumes people make rational choices in the shadow of a trial.
Weighing the risks.
Right. But critics say that model just ignores reality, like the defendant actually being innocent or the lawyer having an impossible caseload or just the sheer psychological pressure.
So people might plead guilty even if innocent.
Yes. Plea negotiations can be what the sources call autonomy limiting. They basically corner innocent people into pleading guilty just to avoid the terrifying risk of a much harsher sentence if they lose at trial. It fundamentally questions whether justice is truly being served.
And we have to talk about race here. How does that factor into wrongful convictions?
Profoundly. The statistics are stark. In the U.S., Black individuals make up about 13% of the population, but over a quarter of arrests, more than a third of people incarcerated. And here's the kicker. Nearly half of all known exonerees, people proven innocent later, are Black.
Half. That's staggering.
It points to much bigger issues, right? Race, class, politics, social capital, all these things shaping justice policy, contributing to mass incarceration, and yes, to wrongful convictions. It's not just about individual cases.
That's critical. What about smaller crimes, misdemeanors? Do wrongful convictions happen there too? We usually hear about felonies.
Oh, absolutely. It's a huge, often invisible problem. It's hard to get exact numbers, but the National Registry of Exonerations found something startling. About 95% of known misdemeanor exonerations were no-crime cases. Meaning the person was convicted, but the thing they were accused of wasn't actually a crime at all, like vague loitering or vagrancy charges that didn't legally apply.
So convicted for nothing.
Essentially, it shows how deep the potential for injustice runs, even for minor offenses.
So looking at all this, what's your sense of the overall scale? Are we just seeing the tip of the iceberg?
That's the really challenging part. Researchers like Samuel Gross and Barbara O'Brien argue the true rate is probably unknowable.
Unknowable. Why?
Because the cases that get overturned, the ones leading to exoneration, they're usually the rare ones with specific factors, DNA evidence maybe, or incredibly dedicated lawyers fighting for years.
Things most cases don't have.
Exactly. Even for death penalty cases, which get the absolute most scrutiny and resources, one study estimated a wrongful conviction rate of 4%.
4% on death row. That's terrifying.
It's deeply unsettling, yeah. It suggests the rate for less serious crimes with fewer resources could be much higher.
And beyond the wrongly convicted person themselves, what about the original crime victims? How does this affect them?
Oh, it's devastating for them, too. It's often called double victimization.
Double.
Yeah. First, they suffered the original crime. Then the system convicts the wrong person, meaning the actual perpetrator is still out there, possibly harming others.
And the victim might feel responsible or blamed.
Often, yes. They might feel re-victimized if they aren't kept informed during the exoneration process, or if media coverage somehow implies they misidentified someone. There's a real need, the sources say, for better, more private communication with victims, and for officials to be clear that victims aren't to blame when the system fails.
Okay, so we've looked deep inside the justice system and its flaws. But what about external pressures? Let's talk about corruption. How does that warp things?
Right, because corruption isn't just about, someone skimming money off the top. Our sources frame it as a really profound social and political problem, a scourge, some call it.
And it's getting more international focus now.
Definitely. Yeah. Big players like the World Bank, the UN, they're developing serious anti-corruption policies. It's recognized as a global threat.
It's interesting how often we talk about corruption, mainly in economic terms, though.
Yeah.
Like its effect on GDP.
That's a really key point the sources make. Yes, it's often analyzed economically low growth financial gain, but that narrow focus can miss the bigger picture. It can even imply subtly that maybe, a few thousand brutal slayings are less important than economic growth, which is a disturbing value judgment.
Right.
And even simple economic models show this. Bribes for standard office supplies. You can deter that with sealed bids, transparency. Yeah. But bribes for building a complex, one-of-a-kind bridge, that involves official discretion, judgment calls, much more opportunity for corruption to creep in.
So connecting the dots.
Yeah.
Corruption is way more than just money changing hands.
Fundamentally, it's a social process. Forget the simple rotten apple idea, just blaming individuals.
It's the barrel, the whole system.
Organizational culture is huge. Corruption involves this mutual swapping of resources of power. People want resources, power, status. They're held back by morals or fear of getting caught. Corruption becomes a tool to get what they want. And critically, misusing organizational power, even if it's not for direct financial gain, like, say, rampant nepotism, that's a huge red flag for potential corruption.
Okay, so how does this systemic corruption directly hurt people? What's the human rights angle?
It leads to direct violations. The sources list several areas. First, political participation. Corruption can kill free speech if media is controlled, or if officials use harsh libel laws to silence critics. It can steal votes through bribery or let wealthy interests dominate campaigns.
Undermining democracy itself.
Exactly. Second, non-discrimination and rule of law. Corruption in the courts. That destroys the right to a fair trial, especially if there's no way to complain about biased judges.
And third?
Social and economic development. This is huge. Corruption twists government spending away from what people actually need. Corrupt officials often prefer massive, capital-intensive projects, big dams, highways, because there are more opportunities for kickbacks, for bribes.
Instead of schools, healthcare.
Precisely. Essential services like education often lose out. Studies actually show a negative link. More corruption, less government spending on education.
Can you give us a concrete, maybe notorious example of this kind of grand corruption?
The Marcos family in the Philippines is a classic, tragic example. Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos started with maybe $7,000 US. 21 years later, their estimated net worth was over $5 billion.
$5 billion, how?
Through incredibly complex schemes, money laundering, offshore accounts, shell corporations, fake names like John Lewis or William Saunders.
And banks played a role.
Yes, unfortunately. Swiss banks with their secrecy-numbered accounts, lawyers using things like Form B to vouch for clients, they made it easier to hide the stolen wealth.
And getting that money back must have been nearly impossible.
Incredibly difficult. You face huge political obstacles, problems with extradition, tricky legal doctrines, like act of state, basically. One country can't easily judge another government's official acts within its own borders. Or head of state immunity, which protects leaders, like we saw with Noriega or Pinochet.
So they're shielded by the law itself sometimes.
Right. Even when Imelda Marcos was tried in the U.S., she was acquitted. It was just too hard to directly link her to all her husband's complex financial crimes.
And this kind of corruption fuels other crime too, right?
Absolutely. It's often the cornerstone for transnational criminal groups enabling drug trafficking, human trafficking, massive fraud. Their sheer wealth makes it incredibly hard for honest officials to resist the pressure or the bribes. It's a vicious cycle.
Okay, so we've painted a pretty bleak picture. Systemic flaws, pervasive corruption. If these problems are so deep, what can actually be done? How are people fighting back?
Well, the consensus in the sources is clear. You need systemic reform, not just plugging leaks. For anti-corruption, there are a few main approaches discussed. You've got interventionism, basically, catching the individual crooks. Traditional law enforcement.
Playing whack-a-mole.
Kind of, yeah. And often not very effective for corruption because it's hidden, it needs endless resources, and just leads to smarter crooks finding new loopholes.
Okay, what else?
Managerialism. This focuses on rules, procedures, controls, more bureaucracy.
Sounds good, but
it can backfire. It might create a culture of if it's not explicitly forbidden, it's okay. And it can actually professionalize corruption offenders just learn to navigate the complex rules better.
So what's the preferred way?
Organizational integrity. This is about changing the culture, the values, the ethical environment itself.
Building integrity from the ground up?
Exactly. Fostering a shared understanding of what corruption is, having safe ways for people to report it, making sure perpetrators are held accountable, promoting ethics training, and crucially strong ethical leadership. Think about, say, a government contract process being guided not just by rules, but by genuine public interest, fairness, objectivity, even courage.
That sounds like a deep cultural change. Can technology play a role in making that happen faster?
Oh, absolutely. Technology can be a powerful tool here. Look at the Calcutta Municipal Corporation in India. Starting back in the mid-90s, they brought in IT reforms, automated tax billing, property assessments, even tracking garbage trucks.
Tracking garbage trucks.
Yeah. It cut down on phantom trips, reduced fuel fraud, a common source of petty corruption. It streamlined everything, reduced the need for face-to-face interactions where bribes happened, and actually boosted employee morale because there was less room for favoritism.
Interesting. Any other examples?
The Philippine Customs Service. They shifted focus from just firing bad apples to completely re-engineering their processes using IT. Their goal was like 80-95% automation, remote filing of documents, paperless, cashless transactions, electronic links between agencies.
Cutting out the human interface points where corruption thrives.
Precisely.
Yeah.
They had things like encrypted payment systems, an online release system for cargo to make the handover secure, reduce the interaction, reduce the opportunity.
Beyond tech, what about bigger legal or institutional reforms?
There's definitely movement there too, globally and nationally. Internationally, you have the OECD pushing countries to criminalize bribing foreign officials. The UN's Palermo Convention helps countries cooperate against transnational organized crime. And groups like Transparency International are vital for raising awareness and pushing for systemic changes.
And domestically?
The Thai Constitution of 1997 is a really interesting example mentioned in the sources. It aimed to fundamentally reform governance by depoliticizing key institutions.
Depoliticizing.
Yeah, making them more independent. Senators have to be nonpartisan. Judicial appointments were taken out of political hands. They strengthened freedom of information, freedom of expression, and mandated that high-ranking officials publicly declare their assets.
Trying to build integrity right into the structure of
Yeah,
government.
that was the goal, yeah. A really significant attempt at systemic reform.
Okay, so lots of efforts underway. But even with all this, are there still major roadblocks, those elephants in the courtroom, that are hard to shift?
Oh, definitely. The sources highlight some persistent challenges. Forensic science is one. Despite big reports, like from the National Research Council in the U.S., pointing out serious issues with the validity and reliability of some forensic techniques and the risk of bias.
Courts still rely on it heavily.
Often, yes. Judges may lack the technical expertise to really evaluate the science properly when deciding if it should even be admitted as evidence. We need better science, clearly, but stricter rules about admitting forensic evidence could also push the disciplines themselves to improve.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
What else?
Appellate courts. These are the higher courts that review convictions. They can be very reluctant to consider fresh and compelling new expert evidence, especially if it challenges the original trial's findings.
Why?
There's a strong emphasis on the finality of litigation, wanting cases to be closed and settled. Reopening factual disputes is seen as problematic.
But what if science evolves?
Yeah.
Or new evidence emerges?
Exactly. It creates this tension. You risk ignoring scientific advances or crucial new information, letting wrongful convictions stand just for the sake of procedural finality. It pits the process against the goal of finding the actual truth.
Wow. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground, from the deep philosophy of why we punish to the heartbreaking realities and complex causes of wrongful convictions, eyewitness error, bad science, plea bargains, racial bias.
And then into the pervasive nature of corruption, how it's not just about money, but fundamentally undermines human rights, with examples like the Marcos regime.
Right. And finally, looking at the fight back, the push for systemic reform, the role of technology, international cooperation, but also the persistent challenges that remain, like in forensics and appeals.
And hopefully you now have a much richer understanding of just how interconnected and complex these challenges are for justice and governance systems everywhere. It's not just about isolated mistakes. It's about deeply embedded issues with real, profound consequences for people's lives. The idea is to give you that deeper context you won't get from just a news headline.
So here's a final thought to leave you with. If understanding these issues is the first step and applying that knowledge is the goal, what role might you play in your own sphere in advocating for or simply supporting transparency, accountability, and ethical integrity? Not just in the grand scale of justice systems, but in any system you're part of, whether it's government, an organization you work for, or even just your local community. Something to think about.